Sue. Thank you very much. You're still with me. Okay, I'm, as Jane has said, going to be talking about a particular approach to evaluation that I've been involved in, and so I'm going to start just by saying a little bit about why my interest has been taken in that direction, and then I will talk you through the methodology very, very briefly, just so you can get an example. I'm not presenting it as a solution, as we talked earlier. It's just an example of how we might think about generating evidence differently. So that's the point, and then I'll finish up with a couple of critical questions, hopefully, that will lead you into the question session after the break. Okay, so we all know that evidence and the impact of youth and community work on the lives of young people has been challenging the profession for decades. I mean, it's not something that is new. But interestingly, what has happened more recently is the focus on developing tools and frameworks that's out there. And I think, whilst I think that's a welcome move forward, I would say that actually what we want to do is more than that. That's a kind of bit of a technical fix. It is perhaps trying to suggest some solutions to these issues. But I think what we need to do is think again about the actual process of evaluation rather than the tools that we use to generate evidence. So that's my argument, really, that we need to think again about whether or not our processes enable us to articulate the value of youth and community workers, youth and community work to young people, so that, or whether the ways in which we go about trying to evaluate actually disenable us from doing that. Already being said, evaluation itself is not a neutral process, it's value laden, and certainly what I know from my practice and also from my teaching is that for many youth work practitioners there is a values clash, and you mentioned that in your discussion, and that's problematic because for me what that has done has shifted youth workers into that place of being done to, exactly as you said, and I think that's problematic. And it's not just in youth and community work. Dalberg et al. Was talking about early childhood education and called evaluation, or some forms of evaluation, technology and control. Everett and Hardicke were talking about that 10 years earlier in the same way. Interestingly, Shaw has been talking about developing a model of evaluation that comes from practitioners' own accounts, rather than trying to develop a model and then and test whether we meet that model. But the problem with that for me is that this does presuppose that youth and community workers are active agents in that, and I think that's where that was the point that led me to my study, really, that actually I didn't think youth and community workers were active agents in the process of evaluation. That's partly to do with managerialism and performativity and low morale, all those sorts of things that actually kind of create feelings of passive resistance rather than active agency. And I was struck by Hammersley when in 2001, when he foresaw a future where the definition of what works or what is success would be something that practitioners would have no control over. And I thought, that sort of rings a bell for me. And I wonder whether, if that's the scenario that we're in, whether or not, that actually restricts our ability to generate primary evidence. So this notion that we need to think again about how we do evaluation, what sort of models we use, and having come from Goldsmiths, of course, I was very much persuaded into the participatory paradigm, and I think I'm just describing that as stakeholder involvement at this stage, but I think that does offer us a way forward. Again, colleagues spoke earlier about this notion of reflective practice being part of of what we do. And I think if we see evaluation as critical praxis, then we can focus on learning and change as well as accountability, which is important for moving forward. The notion of a commitment to local control and capacity building through the process of evaluation enables practitioners and young people, participants, to generate their own learning, and through this develop agency as they learn more about who they are and the context and situation in which they find themselves. It's without doubt that the participatory paradigm, with its emphasis on that stakeholder involvement, is very different from the experimental paradigm that we've just kind of heard about, really, and will generate different kinds of evidence. So we're not claiming that they have the same outcome, but I think there is a danger in privileging any one type of evidence or any one type of methodology, and what I think is that we should be trying to find ways to pull those together as we move forward, seeing how they can support each other in terms of enabling us as a profession to articulate what it is youth and community work can do. So at this point I'll move on and share with you the methodology that I've developed and used. Okay, so basically it was developed initially through work in a voluntary sector youth organisation, and was developed with two aims really. One, to generate evidence of impact. The organisation had been in receipt of some government funding, so they were looking for support in demonstrating what they'd done with that. But also, so the secondary aim really was about trying to redistribute the power inherent in the evaluation process, so that the youth and community workers could re-engage with what I consider as an essential part of their professional practice. So sort of a dual aim there as we went through. So this notion of establishing a dialogue between the evaluators, the youth workers, and the participants, the young people, seen as very much part of that transformative paradigm, that's the claim. So in brief, it's based on the most significant change technique, which some of you may have come across before, developed by Dr. Davis in 1996 in overseas aid work. It's participatory and dialogical in nature. It's an ongoing practice rather than a one-off activity, and it is designed to be shaped by those who use it, which, as you can see, is stage 4 of the process there, meta-evaluation. That's that notion of continual refinement of the actual process of evaluation, so that it takes account of the context in which it is set, seen as a very important part. It generates a number of participants' significant change stories over a given time period, and the systematic and collective analysis of those stories that takes place initially in the youth workers group, and then again with the leaders group. So, as I say, 4-stage process, as you can see from this, and this would be repeated every 3 or 4 months over a year cycle. Okay, so stage 1 involves the youth workers generating significant change stories, and that's a response to an open question about kind of reflecting back, looking back, what's been significant for you in terms of your engagement with this project, what's happened for you over that time as a result of being engaged with this project. So the youth workers would actually ask that question of the young people that they were working with and record the responses verbatim. But the challenge of this bit is engaging the young person in the discussion. Okay, so you're seeking to enable the young person to reflect back on their learning, which is a skillful activity without a doubt. But that promotion of getting young people to reflect back on their learning is something that you mentioned earlier as well, which is really important. So the young people's voices would start the story off. So this is not presented to you, and I know you can't read that, and that's fine because it's not what it's about. It's just to show you how the story is made up. So it starts with the young person's words as generated in that discussion with the youth worker. Stage 2, the youth workers come together and they bring with them 3-4 stories that they've gathered over that time period. And they begin by reading those stories to each other, just using the words of young people. Okay, so they're just going through those stories. And the first stage of analysis is to put those stories into some kind of domains, into some kind of groupings, to indicate what the essence or the nature of that change is about. And again, that's a challenging process for the workers, trying to think through what it is that they've actually been hearing about. And once the domains have been set, then the originating youth worker, so the youth worker that brought that story along, would add context and professional commentary to that story, the background story, okay, to their peers. And engagement in the reflective dialogue that happens whilst the youth worker is explaining the background to the story enables their peers to question and ask and investigate further. So it heightens their reflective practice on that particular intervention, and also helps the practitioner to draft their part of the story, which is then added. Okay. Technicals. There's supposed to be some clicks going on here while Paul comes along. So you've got the second part of the story, which is the words of the generating youth worker. Okay. The next stage of analysis, still within the youth workers group, is to decide within each of the domains then, once they've got this background story as well. I just want to roll the other way. Okay, thank you. So that's the youth workers one. What they're looking to do then is select the most significant change story for each of those domains. Okay, so they're giving their views of why they feel one story is more significant. And this notion of more significant or most significant is in relation to the purpose, values, aims, mission of the organisation. Yeah, so it's kind of basing it within that. And they posed questions to each other, then negotiating these stories, and also creating then a sense of shared meaning about what is it we're doing, what is this project about, what are the outcomes for this project. And they have to agree, it has to be consensus, and they have to come up with a statement as to why they chose that particular story. But we'll get there. There we go. So the third aspect of the story is then added. At this point, these stories then that have been developed in this way are passed to the leaders group. So managers and trustees group in one organisation, a steering group in another organisation. So whoever's kind of in that leadership role of the organisation, they receive these stories. They read these stories aloud to each other. They have a discussion and they choose which of the stories they've been presented with, which is the most significant for that at that period. And they also, I'm really slow, add their reason. Okay, so this is a completed, most significant change story within the process. And as you can see, this story has 4 parts and 13 authors. So it has the young person, the youth worker who worked with that young person, 5 other youth workers, and 6 members of the steering group. all have an input into this story. So this is the product of transformative evaluation methodology, these stories that have been generated. But I argue that actually, they provide rich description of the impact of the youth work interventions on the lives of young people. But the question today to ask is actually, does this count as evidence? Where would it sit with the standards of evidence? Very, very different. There's nothing random about this. The selection of the young people, the discussions, etc., that go on, it doesn't attempt to be that. But whilst it doesn't demonstrate causality using a control group, it isn't that. What I think it can be claimed is that the stories do provide a reasonable and credible expression of the contribution of the project interventions. And I argue that because of the depth of analysis that happens within those groups, the participatory nature of the co-construction of the stories, and the contribution analysis that happens are fundamental, I would suggest, in producing trustworthy and authentic primary data. So these stories are valuable in helping us to prove what's been achieved, but the methodology actually has added value in that it goes beyond the generation of evidence. It enhances practice in the moment. It supports practitioners to become critically reflective about their work, and it does provide a conduit for bottom-up learning within organisations. So if we look at improving practice in the moment, the story generation stage of the evaluation methodology, so the stage one, was shown to enhance the existing relationships between the youth workers and the young people, and thus improving in practice in the moment. It involved workers to develop deeper relationships with the young people that they were working with, and I think that was significant in regards to change in the way practitioners were viewing evaluation. It became meaningful for them, and it became more congruent with their youth work practice and embedded in that practice. So rather than being something that they were doing for other people, gathering the data for the manager, this was part of their practice. And like I say, that shift from being passive to active within the process of evaluation. The generating of the stories also, as I said earlier, did enable the youth workers to engage young people in reflective conversations with young people and illuminating their learning journeys, which is something that what came out in the research was just not being done because of that notion that you did something and you were on to the next thing, very activity-based, very focused. This time for sitting down and talking had diminished. And this process gave them an opportunity to actually validate that notion of conversation. And I think that picks up what Janet was saying, actually. If that's what we say we are doing through youth and community, we say it's a conversational practice, but we've got no time for conversation, there's a bit of a problem there. And that's that notion that our practice is sometimes shaped by the ways in which we evaluate it. So it's really quite powerful, again, for engaging youth workers and youth workers seeing that it had some value to them as well. This notion of sitting down and talking was validated. And certainly the use of dialogue to understand the meaning and value of interventions from a young person's perspective was really important. The other thing that we talked about in terms of the research was this notion of collective reflective dialogue, and how the methodology really centres this process through the analysis and selection stage. And you can see from this quotation that there was some fundamental questioning going on during that analysis, and that it was far deeper than some of the youth workers expected at the beginning. They thought it would be quite straightforward, but found it not so. And actually sort of working out these notions of what is distance travelled, or what is an achievement for a young person, actually was quite, they're complex issues. They're not straightforward, and they can be seen to demonstrate a key characteristic of critical reflective practice, in that it enables us to take a broader view. We step away from reflective practice as problem solving and technical, to actually think about or reflect on the educational goals and values, the core of what we're about, which is important. And there's lots of support for the notion that actually collective discussion can illuminate and challenge assumptions. Then actually it can certainly lift confidence and morale. There was quite a lot of discussion when I interviewed the practitioners about actually how empowering it was to sit and talk with their peers about the good stories, about things that were happening. That's another critique of the methodology, is its appreciative nature. So going back to where I started really, is that I think we need to consider different approaches to evaluation and evidence building, and in particular we need to experiment with participatory methodologies which will re-engage youth and community work professionals in the process as active researchers of their own practice and the practice of their peers. And we need to shift away from the notion that they are data collectors for others, and just trying to do that in the first instance, I think will offer us an opportunity to actually generate some really useful primary data as we go. And transformative evaluation is just one example that's been developed further by Janet and her colleagues, and there's loads of space for more. This is a creative space to come along into, and I think that notion that it changes the ways in which youth and community workers feel that they can engage in that. The final slide here, I just wanted to say a little bit about how these practices can inform, in terms of evidence-informed youth and community work practice. So I think transformative evaluation and other participatory methodologies have much to offer. For example, it does address the research base. I mean, that's an area that we struggle in terms of having something there that we can look at. But it does address that by providing primary data. I think what we need to do is then think about what we do with that. And again, something that you identified earlier is that actually we have to do something with that primary data, but how do we go about that when the funding is so limited in terms of further research? I think participatory forms and transformative evaluation in particular does acknowledge and extend professional expertise, so again supports that sphere as well, particularly in the development of self-efficacy and agency, which is really valuable. And you could argue that participatory approaches will do take account of clients' values and expectations. However, I will close now with a couple of critical questions. First is the issue of trust. And it's the accountability movement, as we all know, favours quantitative over qualitative data, and there was mentioned earlier that there are many who would argue that youth work cannot and should not be measured. But I ask, are we ready to trust young people themselves to judge the shape and extent of their learning? And are we ready to trust that youth workers and young people together can generate honest and meaningful interpretations of youth work. Perhaps somewhere in the middle ground there is a notion of using outputs as proxies for outcomes and using the narrative alongside that, so that coming together of different ways of generating evidence, but actually trying to bring them together to create the best accounts, the best accounts of the difference that youth and community work can make. And my last critical question is just this one really, about in the process of evaluation, in the process of accountability, and in the shape of this model, who is the client? And that's the one for me that's the elephant in the room question. Because if the client is the young person, that gives us a very different answer than if the client is the funder. And that's something we need to think about. It takes us back to the question of whether evaluation is a form of social control, shaping our practices to suit the powerful rather than the powerless. And of course then that takes us straight into that old debate of what is the purpose of youth and community work. It's a good place to end. Thank you.